Hello, Deena.
Hi, Pastor Craig. Good morning, Paradox. Okay, so my first question is, since the four Gospels don't offer us a fully corroborated testimony, how do you suggest we hold on to our faith when there's a possibility it could all be in vain?
Starting off with a softball, Deena. I appreciate that. How do we know this all isn't just a waste of time, right? So here's the thing. We have this idea that we're grown up with when we're raised in the church, that the highest form of faith is to trust someone else's experience about God, right? So somebody else experiences the resurrection and they tell us, and the test of faith is whether or not we trust them in the way they see it, right? I don't believe that God would ask you to trust anything that you haven't found to be true in your own life. So the question is, how have you experienced resurrection in your own life? Because the fact is, resurrection is happening all around us. I mean, think about this beautiful existence and look at the stars and realize those stars are all dying and yet being born over and over again. You want to talk about eternal life? Yes, it's a reality that we experience. When you talk about light that casts off from the star, it goes on forever and ever and ever as far as we can tell. And just when it reaches the edge of the universe keeps moving back so the light can keep going. This is mind-blowing stuff. And when we talk about resurrection, I mean, everything we eat is dead and it gives us life. And so there is something personal that we know about resurrection. So I think that contradictions can help us see through the facade of the highest form of faith is to trust someone else and start to say, wait, do I know that resurrection is true? Because if I know it's true, then I don't need someone else to tell me it's true. And then when other people start to tell you it's true, you say, yes, we see the same thing, we experience the same thing, and that's when you experience community and solidarity and love and relationship.
Okay. My second question is, how would the message of the resurrection change if the witnesses were men?
Oh, no. My guess is Jesus would rise from the dead with a sword and go and cut off the heads of every Roman soldier around him and then say, follow me and pay your taxes. That's how I think it would change.
My last question is, out of the four accounts of the resurrection, which resonates with you the most?
Mark's, great question. I'm so happy you asked this. Mark's is my favorite. Because we have this idea that if we were there with Mary Magdalene, right, and we saw it for ourselves, we would be like, yes, I believe. It'd be so much easier if you walked in the empty tomb for yourself, right? That's not how Mark's gospel goes. Mark's gospel goes, they walk into the tomb. I might get that detail a little bit wrong. They go into the tomb or they look into the tomb and they see an angel that says, he's not here, he is risen. And you know what Mark says they did then, the women did? They ran away in great fear. And that's the end of Mark's gospel. So they're very afraid when they were the closest people to resurrection. Now, what's important to know is about 300 years later, the church was like, this ending's making people uncomfortable. So they added an ending to Mark to make you feel more comfortable. It starts in verse 9 in most Bibles. And the good Bibles are the ones who denote that say like, hey, our earliest manuscripts don't have after verse 9 in chapter 16. So Mark's gospel I love because it reminds me to look through that facade of saying like, oh man, if I lived at a different time, or if I was there in Palestine and like could see the resurrection for myself, I was there like just outside of Jerusalem, I could see the resurrection for myself, oh, then I'd believe. Mark's gospel says, no, if you were there, you would actually have more fear. And that reminds me that God is right here. Great questions, Deena. Wow, those are excellent.
Okay. What do you think the church would look like if we had always honored Mary as first?
I think it would be much less of a win-lose contest of like, these people win so they get to go to heaven, and these people lose so they get to go to hell. I think it would have been much more inclusive. I think it would have been much more understanding that resurrection changes things, not keeps everything the same. I mean, can you imagine if resurrection kept everything the same? That's like the most opposite intuition of what resurrection should be on a gut level. So I think that when we think about how, if we would have acknowledged Mary as the high priest and reminded ourselves of that, I think it would have reminded us that everything changes once God enters the picture. And then the really shocking part is that God's been there all along, and we've been preventing God from being who God is. So, in my opinion, it would change in the fact that it would remind us that there is a constant change and movement to get closer and better acquainted with the ways of God than it is like, oh, we're depraved, you better repent, and you better join my side, because there's winners and there's losers.
How come these contradictions are never talked about?
I'm laughing because, sorry to reference the TikTok comments again, but you can see very clearly why they are not. They make people very uncomfortable, and people don't know what to do with them, because if you discover them as a Christian, you're told that if you actually acknowledge them as contradictions, you're betraying the faith. And so people don't really want to acknowledge them because they like being part of a bigger community. People on the outside of Christianity, people who sometimes are like anti-Christian and say like, well, I want to highlight the contradictions. This one is a bit of a deep cut. You really have to put all four of the Gospels side by side and recognize how it is that they are contradict and are the same to each other. And that requires a lot of Bible study. So there are some blatant contradictions that people who like to undermine the faith often highlight. But these contradictions are really important, really central to the resurrection, and they're never talked about because I think the church is afraid of what's on the other side of it. And in my opinion, I think it's a beautiful teacher, and it reminds us to hold up a mirror to ourselves and ask how we've been complicit in the sin of sexism. So,
How do you feel about this contradiction specifically in relation to the Depp/Heard trial and similar situations in our current day?
This is very hard to answer in a vacuum. I'm not sure who asked this question, which is fine, and I'm not sure if they're on Amber Heard's side of this or Johnny Depp's side of this. I think the thing that's really important for us to remember is that when we look at our own lives, we often buy into the myth that we'll be happier once we have more money. I hope that the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial has made you realize that that simply is not true. That money will not solve your problems. And there's obviously an issue of poverty that we have to talk about and we have to address. And there is a baseline we have to get people to. But after a certain point, money cannot help you anymore. So when it comes to how do you feel about this contradiction specifically in relation to that, I think that when you look at the way our legal system works, it's very much let's name a winner and a loser instead of like how can we somehow make peace with this and right what has been wrong. And so if I were to back up and zoom out of that trial just a bit more, I would say look at all of the legal system, and it's all very much rooted in the punishment business and not in the restoration business, which is what real justice is about.
Are there any non-canonical sources? Okay. Sources that give additional perspectives to resurrection event?
Not really is the answer. The best thing that you have is you have other non-canonical, which means outside of the Bible, sources talking about Christians who are willing to give their lives, saying that they believe Jesus rose from the dead. So it's more of like a second-hand or third-hand reference that's beyond the Bible. But that's a great question to ask. There's definitely, you can see how Christians all of a sudden went from this underground grassroots movement for over the next 300 years. It finally became, or eventually became, the national religion of the Roman Empire, which is really, really stunning, and I would say has some pros and cons to it. And if you don't understand the cons, I'm happy to talk to you after the service.
Why did God choose a woman as the first witness?
I don't know is the answer. I would love to answer on behalf of God. If I could offer a bit of speculation, I think it's once again that resurrection changes things. And I think that resurrection for us has been marketed as a test, which is a literal and basic meaning for what it actually is. Whereas if the resurrection story was being told today, based on how the church often discriminates and attacks queer persons, I believe the resurrection story would be told through the lens of a queer first witness. I think that it's very much relevant to the time it was written in, and the fact that, even suggesting a woman could be the high priest is, so radical that Christians today can't even comprehend that it's in there. And yet, when it was pointed out to me, I said, how did I miss this for so long? A flat stone, 2 angels, small enclosure, 1 person. It's so obvious, but I didn't hear about this until I was in my doctoral work. And it just shows you how much we kind of buy into, the resurrections corroborate each other, so they're all saying basically the same thing. No, they're all very beautiful paintings that are trying to describe the indescribable, and it's worthwhile getting lost in the inspiration of it to see just how radical these writings are.
What did it mean historically for someone to be the high priest? How does that meaning translate to our current day and age? And how do religious hierarchies compare and contrast?
It's hard. I guess the best comparison might be the president of the Mormon Church, who LDS brothers and sisters, they believe that, or some of them believe that the president of the Mormon Church talks directly to God. So that's kind of what the high priest was held in that high of regard when it came to Jewish folks, and before them the Israelite folks. So when we talk about what that means, it's important for us to acknowledge that this is much more of a direct connection to God, this high priest person. And they would go into the most holy place 1 day a year on the Day of Atonement and stand in the presence of God. And when they would go in, they'd have bells on because the lower priests, or the not so high priests, would listen for those bells, because if those bells stopped jingling, they would have to potentially go into the most holy place because they were worried that God was angry with them and God killed the high priest. So there was systems put in place to make sure that they didn't have to go in. Like, I've heard some sources say that they tied a rope to the high priest so that they could drag him out if God got angry. And so when you talk about what a high priest is today, you have to think of someone who a religious group thinks talks directly to God in a higher access. And while that may sound counterintuitive to what the message of Jesus is, which is God talks to all of us equally, I think that the important part to acknowledge is that women are included in the highest positions of religion from the very moment Christianity begins, the resurrection.
What is the significance of the resurrection?
It's everything, right? It's the way of life in this universe. It is the way that we talk and breathe and move. You could even get to the point where you feel like resurrection is the fact that you breathe in air and exhale out something different. Resurrection is all around us, and while it is important to look at this historical event from the life of Jesus, it's also important for us to acknowledge it in our own lives today. I think that the reason that this church exists is to help you see and embrace Jesus Christ in all. And we believe that spiritual maturity is when you are able to see the Christ, which is the eternal God beyond name, beyond description, beyond all creation. When you're able to see the Christ in everything that you experience, then, and we've helped you to do that in some way, shape, or form, then that's what we're trying to get you to do. Because when you recognize that God is all around you, you actually believe in the omnipresence of God or the power of God. And it's hard to do sometimes, like in lament. It's hard to do when things don't go our way. And yet the story of the gospel is that God is with us even in our brokenness. So, do we have a couple more questions there, Thomas? Or let's do a lightning round. Let's go real quick.
Okay. How did the authors know who witnessed the resurrection? Were they there too then?
John claims to be there after the women came back. Mary Magdalene came back and told him. And so John claims to have seen the empty tomb after that. The way the male authors do it is usually God or Jesus shows up to them later, which is like, really? Did he? But, I understand why they put that in there. They got to be included too. It's fine. So that would be my answer on that.
Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute?
No, she was not. She was not. It's nowhere in the Bible. It's just added by a male pope 600 years after her life. And you think about one of the great injustices of the church, it's designating her as forgiven prostitute when she is nowhere denoted that she lived a life of sex work. So let's all work together to end that rumor, shall we?
Do you think it speaks on women that Mary witnessed even possibly 2 angels? Is it the most in the Bible people have seen? Don't people go mad from it?
I think it depends on what you decide. We're now getting to the qualification of what qualifies as an angel sighting. I think Isaiah might be up there. I have to make a spreadsheet. That's the only way I know. I think Isaiah and then John and Revelation, if you want to count that. But I believe there's other instances that more than 2 were seen on the ground. But I'll follow up on that. If anybody wants to email me and remind me to follow up on that, email Craig at Paradox Redlands and I'll look at that. So great question.
What does the Bible or historical events say about Mary after becoming the high priest?
There's not a lot, which is really important for us to stand up and still acknowledge her as an integral part of the Christian story. There is a Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Most scholars have debunked that as being written well after her lifetime. But there is some value in acknowledging that because it reminds us that she has a story too. And so while we don't have her story written down really well, that doesn't mean she's any less of a real person. So remind yourself she was a full person that lived beyond what these 4 men remember about her, and acknowledge her with that and fill in the details. And it's okay to fill in the details as long as you acknowledge you're filling in the details. So,
where does the narrative that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were together come from?
Men, probably. Martin Scorsese made a movie about it in 1988. There's a couple others. I haven't heard a lot of women advocate for that, but if they were, great. I don't think it changes much about her, honestly. I think it's much more important to acknowledge her religious title. Last one.
Okay. How does James' belief in Jesus corroborate the resurrection?
So James is the brother of Jesus. And I have to say that if you get your brother after you are dead to go tell the world that you have risen from the dead and that your brother is Lord, you've pretty much conquered every barrier there is. So James was much more rooted in like a social justice oriented kind of gospel, but it stayed very much in Jerusalem. Paul was very much everyone's included in this, and because he believed that so strongly, he went way out past Jerusalem and talked to people way beyond the gates of Jerusalem and included everyone. And I think it's best if we acknowledge both of their presence and both of their work. And there are people, James and Paul had a hard time with each other, and there's lots of good reasons for that. But I think it's important to acknowledge the work of both of them because it's the work of the church is to be a great includer and also work actively toward justice. So that's what I would say, and James gave his life to this. So Deena, thank you so much to you. Thank you to all of you for your great questions. And you know, I think this is the most we've ever had on one Saturday since we've been showing these videos of people who are here. So Jordan Cattenhorn is back there. He shot the whole thing. Crystal was one of the artists, which it was phenomenal. And then Bobby was a grip. It was Zoe here. I think I saw Zoe. Maybe I didn't. No, I don't think I did. Okay. And then Olivia was a model. So there's lots of people who are here. Is there anyone else that I missed that's here? My mom. My mom was a model as well. So good job, Mom. I want to say thank you. I don't think I'm supposed to say this, but that one's my favorite one. I just love the art. I love the music, and I just love the artists, everything that came out of it. So I can't thank the people who worked on it enough. I can't thank you enough for participating in this film. And just thank you so much for being here. We're going to celebrate together and then sing one more song together. But thank you again for everything.